of people living in social housing in the country, and it also has one of the highest rates of home ownership. So most people have a real vested interest in maintaining our current system of allocating housing through the market and through home ownership. And the current austerity we are seeing from our contemporary government, and my great fear, the austerity that could emerge in the aftermath of COVID-19, definitely has the possibility to make a bad situation worse. But I always like to acknowledge that the current situation we're in with regards to housing is not ideal, because I think sometimes when we're doing anti-austerity work, it can be really tempting to pretend that the system we have right now is adequate in any way. And I'm sure any housing organizer across the country will tell you that, our current situation for housing is profoundly failing a lot of people.
I'm going to come back to this. I just wanted a quick clarifying comment. Now, Toronto is about, I think, 50% renter households. I think Montreal is even higher. What is it like in Calgary, for example?
Yes. So in Calgary, we're looking at a little over 80% of people who own their homes. So it is highly unusual for people in Calgary to rent, and it often tends to be more of an indication of a generational gap rather than an indication of class. That this is not always true, but that is kind of the prevailing trend. Something I think is really interesting and really important is finding ways to meaningfully build solidarity and relationships between tenants and between homeowners. I think there's a lot of power in building coalitions simply around the idea of anyone who does not control other people's housing, is welcome in our coalitions for just housing.
Thanks, Kate. Leilani, I want you to take this maybe to a different level. Kate's kind of focusing on the province. I'm hoping you can kind of maybe explain to people what's happening globally, maybe since 2010, after the financial crisis, in the kind of financialization world.
Yeah, so the way I like to describe it is really we saw a complete change of the housing landscape after the global financial crisis. Really, it took a few years. I mean, we saw a huge change with the global financial crisis because the global financial crisis is actually a misnomer. It was really a global housing crisis, right? It was all about homes and mortgages attached to homes and whether people could actually afford those mortgages and predatory lending. It was all about housing. But it took a few years for these big financial actors, big capital as we might call them, to kind of figure out a system that was going to make them some money. And figure it out they did. So really led by Blackstone, which is the largest private equity firm in the world, based in the US, but it's a multinational actor. It's absolutely a global actor. They developed a model with big tech, actually, that enabled them to purchase a lot of bad debt. And bad debt is basically distressed assets. This is all in their language, okay? So a distressed asset is a home owned by a family. They can't make their mortgage payments. Global financial crisis hits, they really can't make their mortgage payments. And they are suffering foreclosure. And the banks have all of this bad debt on their books, and they have to deal with that. So the banks in 08 and 09 were like, oh my gosh, we have a flood of bad debt on our books. We need help. And in swooped the big financial actors who said, we'll take your bad debt off your hands if you give us a deal, if you put that bad debt for sale. So they went on a shopping spree and they bought a whole lot of bad debt at a reduced rate. So just like, for sale, an on sale item. And then they did some modest upgrades. This is mostly single family homes at this point, modest upgrades. And then they turned those homes into rental accommodation. And they knew they had a captive market because they knew all these homeowners had just been evicted from their homes and would need a place to live. And so homeowners became renters en masse, and but paying heavy rents, sometimes actually paying rents that are more than what their mortgage payments would have been, etc. So that is what began something. And what was so new was the numbers. I mean, Blackstone bought, I think in one full swoop, something like between 40 and 60,000 single family homes like that. And it was the unprecedented number and the unprecedented amount of capital that started to flood into residential real estate. From single families, they went also into multifamilies, and that's like apartment buildings. And so they started purchasing apartment buildings, and this has now become a model that asset management firms use, pension funds use, insurance companies, and private equity. And that model is you buy a building, you do modest repairs, and you use those repairs often to get around legislation and jack up the rents. And so, you know, there's in Toronto, for example, Achilles is a well-known asset management firm that uses this model. I would say has perfected this model from their side. And so that's the landscape that really emerged from the global financial crisis. And I'll just reiterate that what makes it new, I mean, housing's been commodified for a long time. Mortgages, that's a financial instrument. So mortgages attached to housing and to buildings, that's existed for a long time. What's new is the unprecedented amount of money. The actors are global. They're faceless, nameless. They're not accountable in any way. And they have tremendous political power. They sit at political tables.
We're going to come back to this. I want to quickly jump to Kate. Kate, you had mentioned when we were talking earlier that the group you work with, Renters Action Movement, came out of a group called Women Together Ending Poverty. Can you maybe describe maybe a little bit what that process was, but also kind of I think the kind of gender lens to look at housing isn't often used. I'm seeing it a bit more and more kind of at policy levels, but I think that that's new in terms of my universe, but a lot of people have been working on this for decades. Could you maybe talk a bit about kind of how women are predominantly affected by this, or the gender lens?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Renters Action Movement, as you said, came out of a group then called Women Together Ending Poverty, now called We Are Together Ending Poverty. And I think what is really interesting about applying a gendered lens to housing is that the household more generally is one of the main sites of oppression of women in our society. In the unequal allocation of domestic and household labor, the way that the privacy of the household allows like violence against women to continue. So housing is really a place where gender equality can, you know, be fought for, and is a great terrain of struggle there. One like really obvious concrete way in which this happens is that we know that women who are attempting to leave situations of domestic violence and intimate partner violence oftentimes are unable to do so because they are unable to have housing. And when you consider things like the gender wage gap between men and women, the fact is that in, you know, a heterosexual relationship, that acts as a coercive power. You know, if you are in a relationship with someone and you cannot leave that relationship because you rely on them for housing, or because you rely on them to, as I said, like provide you with housing, you know, it absolutely acts as like a coercive force on your relationship with that person and on gender more generally. So, you know, I think absolutely, like having more public housing that was accessible to more people, that is a women's issue, and that is an issue that you can absolutely look through for a gendered lens, because populations like women, non-binary people, gender non-conforming people, trans people are going to be much more vulnerable to shifts in housing than in other groups, and can be fundamentally protected from certain forms of violence by the mere existence of guaranteed housing.
Thanks. Thanks, Kate. Leilani, I was hoping you might be able to talk a little bit about what's happening, the state of things today in Canada.
You mean right now? Like,
Yeah, like
point of view, yeah.
the state kind of things in Canada in
Yeah.
terms of just what you're seeing in the markets or
What,
what you're seeing
Yeah.
in terms of homelessness.
web conference. Okay.
Yeah, so it looks like Erica's joined us. That's nice. Hi, Erica. um, well, I'd like to talk about the pandemic a little bit, if I might, and what it has exposed, because it lays bare, all the pandemic has done in terms of housing is laid bare what was before the pandemic. There's nothing, the pandemic didn't create anything new with housing, which is, I think, what Kate said in her beginning comments or alluded to. And so, you know, there's three groups that I like to identify as really suffering in this country. And actually, this is pretty much a global phenomenon. There's people who are homeless, there are renters, and you have to think about renters and their vulnerability, because if you are unable to rent, if for whatever reason you can't rent, you don't have enough money or you've been evicted, the next place that you go is homelessness. So we have to understand renters as a very vulnerable population. Not all renters, of course, but many renters. I'll get to that. And homeowners. So those are the three groups that I like to look at. And you say, and Kate alluded to this too, it's like are homeowners a vulnerable group? But there will be a section of homeowners who are vulnerable, who are lower income, and yet homeowners. And I love this idea that Kate suggested of forming those sorts of alliances between those groups, because we'll never win this if we don't form new alliances and unusual alliances. But let me just go through each and tell you what I think is happening in Canada. Prior to the pandemic and during the pandemic, we have about 235,000 homeless people in any given year in Canada. That's a number that has been persistent and over many years, you know, a decade at least. And that's troubling in the 10th largest economy in the world. I mean, it is actually completely unacceptable. Under international human rights law, of course, homelessness is a prima facie violation of the right to housing. You don't need to be an international human rights lawyer to understand that. Obviously, the right to housing is the right to live somewhere with peace, security, and dignity. And all of those are disrupted in a very significant way if you're living in homelessness. So that is testament to the failure of governments across this country to effectively implement the right to housing, period. There's no other way to understand homelessness in an affluent country like Canada. It's the failure of the governments. And I say governments plural because it's national level government, the provinces and territories, as well as the municipalities. So a big fail there. And if we turn to renters, you see, when I describe financialization, we took it from 2010, 12, somewhere around there. But in actual fact, the landscape had been made ripe. That's probably, I'm mixing metaphors, but it had been laid properly, well, for financialization to take hold in this country. And that's because of neoliberalism. So that started in the Mulroney years and, you know, comes from Thatcher and Reagan and Pinochet. I mean, you know, very good company. And why did neoliberalism what about neoliberalism? Well, neoliberalism is what allows governments to take that big step back from housing, divest themselves of their responsibilities for social housing, and, you know, saying, oh, here, market, you take over, you're going to address the needs of the people, which we know now is just simply not true. Neoliberalism also allows for weaker tenant protections. And so, you know, where you don't have really good rent caps or rent freezes, where you don't have long tenancies like leases, you know, so like 1-year leases, whereas in some countries, you know, leases are 10 years long, you know, so quite shocking. I remember when I was rapporteur and I first learned that, I was like, are you kidding me? In Canada, we only have 1-year leases. Anyway, if you're lucky. So the ground had been laid for the precarity that renters now find themselves in. So if you take that neoliberal legislative and policy regime that we're living in, we're still living in that, and you add to that financialization and the rapid escalation of affordability or lack of affordability, escalation of costs of housing, you have renter precarity. So that's why after 1 month of underemployment in a pandemic or 1 month of unemployment in a pandemic, people are like, I can't pay the rent. I mean, why is that? So one thing we know about human behavior of renters, the first thing they pay is their rent. Most households, homeowners are the same. The first thing they pay is the mortgage. And if that means going to the food bank and going to the Salvation Army to get clothes or the church to get clothes for your children, you do that because you know that your priority is housing, because without it, you're homeless, and that's a complete disaster, especially for families and single women, etc. So the precarity of renters is where we're at right now. And lastly, I'll say homeowners. Now, this is a population who maybe most people wouldn't expect to be living in a precarious situation. But again, housing's expensive, and the affordability issue is now coming home to roost with homeowners, because it's known that people in Canada are over indebted. We are one of the most indebted populations in the world. And Canada used to be known as a country of savers. And now we are one of the most indebted countries in the world by household. And so homeowners have overextended, and suddenly in the midst of a global deadly pandemic, they're unemployed, receiving, if they're lucky, the CERB at $2,000 a month, which doesn't stretch far enough when you've got a hefty mortgage. So that, I think, is a pretty good snapshot. And that was a snapshot of Canada, but that could have been a whole number of countries around the world.
Thanks for providing that overview. A lot of good information there. Erica, are you available right now? Are you off mute? Just gonna give a second here. Still seem to be on mute. I'd like to intro you. All right, I am going to come back to Erica in a. Oh, hey, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hey, Erica, thanks for joining us. Erica, I was just hoping you might be able to give folks just a brief introduction, where you are, what you do.
Okay, I live in the downtown east side of Vancouver. I work as an activist advocate for the homeless, especially the ones that are the visible homeless right on the street.
Okay, thanks. One thing I'm hoping you might be able to do for us, Kate in Calgary and Leilani are you in Ottawa? Yes. They kind of gave us maybe an understanding of how things were rolling out, like at the kind of national level. And Kate had talked about how things are working out at maybe a provincial level. How are things working out in the downtown east side, maybe over the last 10 years?
Okay, we've seen a steady decline in housed people. There's the visible, the homelessness that's going on the street is like extreme. It's the worst I've ever seen it. There's no washrooms at night for those living on the street, so their only place to go is the alleys. There's no places to clean up during the day because all the centers are closed. It's declining really fast. You'd think you were living in a third world country if you came to the downtown east side. Along with the homelessness, there's also police brutality. There's lack of places for people to even hydrate during the day when it's really hot and sunny out. So I have a team that goes out into the streets feeds them at supper time. Um, yeah, I'm at home right now, so I'm having to deal with that too. So
I understand, Erica.
yeah,
Not
we go out at least 3 times a day. We pick up all the water and stuff to hydrate the people on the street, and we go out and deliver it. And I've been part of a downtown Eastside response team, so we get funding in, so I'm able to pay peers to help me to do this. And that has been really awesome. I love being the one to actually be able to help people out, even if it's a little bit. And it got really kind of hard the first month after I started this, because getting the people on the street fed and everything and keeping them fed actually was a dream of my youngest son. And he died alone in his hotel room on April 7th. So it after a while, I took it as a drive. I'm carrying on my son's dream, so that's why I've kept this up.
I'm really sorry to hear that, but I'm really happy to hear you're helping a lot of folks in the downtown east side. Eric, I used to work in the downtown east side about 10 years ago when I grew up in Poco. And I'm wondering, one of the things that I think was interesting for me was just how many kind of northern Indigenous folks ended up in the downtown east side, and how many Indigenous folks from kind of other parts of that area ended up there. Can you maybe describe kind of that element of it, or some kind of insights into kind of how that affects, trying to find housing, trying to get services, trying to deal with all the constant issues of police brutality and discrimination?
Yeah, I have encountered a lot of Indigenous people from actually all over Canada. A lot of them have filtered their way through just because you're able to sleep outside in the summertime here. So streets get really overcrowded. People are coming this way hoping that they'd be able to find somewhere to stay. And I know there's a lot of Indigenous people homeless that were experiencing homelessness wherever they're from, and find it hard to carry on as a homeless person there. So they've made their way to Vancouver, and the streets have become really overly crowded. My fear was that, if this pandemic hit the streets of Vancouver, it would wipe us out. But I believe our Creator has His eyes on the people that are on the streets, and that's the only reason we pulled through this the way we have. We've consulted with United Native Nations, as well as human rights specialists. I was trying to look into contacting each one of these bands and telling them the exact number of people they have on the street, and ask, what are you planning to do about it? And we were just going to get this lifted off the ground when this COVID-19 hit. So kind of put everything on the back burner.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Well, I'm glad to hear that folks are taking care of each other and surviving. And folks like you are out there helping people. Again, a lot of people don't. I wanted to switch back to our other panelists for a second. So we've kind of talked a bit about where things are at now. I'm wondering if you folks could maybe briefly talk about how we got here. Maybe, how the system kind of ended up in this way. And I'm going to start with Kate, and then I'm going to go to Leilani and then Erica.
How we got here really broadly is that we live in a society that incentivizes home ownership. And in fact, incentivizes might not even be a strong enough word. It is actually often a necessity for a lot of people. You know, home ownership is how people send their kids to college. Home ownership is how people retire in this country. All of those things, you know, like, you cannot retire in Canada basically unless you are able to own your home and not pay rent when you are an adult, if you are trying to retire on the Canada pension plan. And this is a really specific tool of capital and of our governments because it creates a certain kind of person. Leilani mentioned neoliberalism earlier and also mentioned Thatcher. And one of the main things that Thatcher did in Britain, where I grew up, is that she completely dismantled the public social housing program. So a lot of people lived in what was called council housing or social housing. This was public, semi-public, cooperative housing that was not used as a financial instrument. And the reason that this was so important and so effective as part of her political project is that by giving the working class people who had lived in council housing a stake in private property ownership and a stake in their houses financially, accumulating finances, it basically made an entirely different type of person with an entirely different type of politics. And that might sound like a bit of an overstatement, but how we interact with the world around us is, created by what we are experiencing. And the fact of the matter is that when you are living in commodified housing in any way, and that's both tenants and homeowners, that home is your home, but it is also a financial instrument. So I rent a 2-bedroom house here in Calgary. I live in my home. It is where I live. It is where I have my books. It's where I cook my meals, but it is also a financial instrument for my landlords. It is a way in which they make money. And if it does not give them returns on their investment at a certain rate, it is not a good financial instrument. So that kind of just like basic facts encourage the financialization of housing that Leilani talked about, and really moves us away from housing as a human right, which is the starting point that we have to be going from. In my opinion, it is impossible to reach housing as a human right in a society where we have a profit motive for housing, and in a society where housing is allocated by your ability to pay for it. If I did not work, I would not be able to afford to live in my home. And I think that is functionally immoral. So it's very much about profit kind of eroding the way we allocate goods and resources in our society. And it's also about how specifically neoliberalism has given large groups of people as a stake in maintaining home ownership and maintaining specific ways of organizing our society. And that means that moving to a place where housing is a human right also requires looking at a lot of different things. It also requires looking at how we fund post-secondary education. It requires looking at how people retire, how people enter into continuing care and long-term care facilities. And once you start looking at housing and the way in which housing as a financial instrument is connected to other things, I really saw, at least for myself, the way that housing was connected to so many other issues that we face in our society, and so many other demands that are being made in this moment for a just post-COVID-19 recovery.
Thanks, Kate. Leilani, I think all of you can tackle this kind of how we got here in a different way. You can go all the way back to colonialism. You could start with kind of a lot of the mortgage financialization. You could start with the legalization of real estate investment trusts in Canada in the 90s. So I'll leave it to you kind of where to start, but where, in your opinion, how did we get here? What are the kind of main things from your analysis that got us to where we are today?
I thought Kate was incredibly eloquent and said it so well. So, maybe I'll just sort of build out a little bit on what she said. But really, Kate, you captured it, I thought, quite perfectly. What I'm trying to do in my work is get us to understand what it means to embrace the notion of housing as a human right. And I do think that that notion was lost along the way. I actually think there was a time when in this country, housing was understood as a human right, even if it wasn't articulated that way. I think there was a time when there was an understanding that housing would provide people with security. And I think after the war, World War II, after World War I, I think there was a sense that people need home. And certainly in the 50s, I think that was true, and in the 60s. And then things started to change as we sort of, got further into the 70s. And so I want to, I don't want to, you can't return to a time, and things are so different now. So I'm not really suggesting we return to the 50s. Lord knows for women, we don't want to go there, and many other groups. But I do think that society got lost about what home is about. And it's funny because we haven't similarly got really lost about healthcare. No one questioned when the pandemic hit that the government should go out and get ventilators, for God's sake, and get PPE for everyone who needs it. There was absolute consensus. And it wasn't just national consensus, it was global consensus, right? But there is not global consensus that every homeless person should be housed during the pandemic. Well, when you have a stay-at-home policy, to me, there's no difference between a stay-at-home policy to prevent people from dying from a pandemic, from contracting the disease and from spreading it. There is actually no difference between a ventilator and a home. They're serving the same function, keeping people alive. And yet there's a completely different understanding of ventilator and healthcare and a home. Similarly, education. Parents are up in arms that their children are not getting the education that they need. And at the same time, everyone recognizes that governments have to do something to make sure that kids can get as much schooling as possible during this pandemic. And yet the same is not felt for housing. So I think what Kate was talking about, that we've gotten away from that, and we've gone down this commodification road, and I think it's happened a little bit incrementally, and then I think more recently it's happened with a sledgehammer, and so that, I think that's how we got here. I just want to say one other thing that is not really answering your question, but it's interesting. Kate talked about the way in which her apartment, her building or house or whatever, I don't know where you live exactly, is a financial instrument for her landlord. But it's even more of a financial instrument than she said, because any bets her landlord is actually using that building to leverage more capital to replicate his or her this income generating, investment protecting business. And so one of the things we need to do is get business owners to realize that they're in the business of human rights. And where I'd like to finesse what Kate said a little bit, not finesse, but just maybe shed some other light on it, is, I don't want to put human rights as like against housing for profit. I don't want to set up that binary situation. What I want to say is capitalism, no problem. Housing for profit, no problem, as long as you meet the conditions of the human right to housing. So if you can do that through capitalism, be my guest, go ahead. And if you can't, well, then you can't. I'm asking capitalists and capitalism to be responsive to human rights, and let's see where we go. We might get pretty far, actually, if it can be responsive. And the government of Denmark did that recently, and I found it fascinating. I mean, they adopted a pretty heavy law. It was called the Blackstone Law, Blackstone being that big private equity firm. And I mean, it was really law to inhibit Blackstone from coming into Denmark and buying up properties and making them unaffordable. What the Minister of Housing said was, Blackstone, come on in. You're welcome to come to Denmark. But in Denmark, housing is a human right. And here's our legislation. And I love that way. Let's see how far we go with that. Now, that's not to say we don't need more investment in social housing by governments. We absolutely do. And the pandemic has exposed that very clearly. That's not to say we don't need government to be acting more proactively, addressing homelessness and all of that. Of course, I totally agree with all of what Kate said in that regard. So, but just to say, let's see if capitalism can respond. You want to be in the business of housing, then you're in the business of human rights.
Thank you, Leilani. Erica, hoping we can get you off mute there now, because I did want to ask you the same thing. How did things get to where they were at the downtown East Side? And again, please feel free to kind of use any kind of starting point you want. Could be the last 50 years, could be 1700s. I'm just gonna wait for Erica to get off mute here if she is able.
Okay, I honestly believe that this all started, like you're talking about human rights. Our rights were taken away when they started removing our children from the reserve, removing from their parents, where we got all that rich teaching, where we all had that guidance of our uncles, aunties, brothers and sisters all around us. And then suddenly it was like the carpet was literally shaken beneath our feet. And we, a lot of people had a hard time getting back up on their feet again. When that right to be ourselves on, in our reserves. I mean, the declarations that came from the throne, and one of them was human rights, was all about human rights, about our rights to an education, a right to housing, a right to, I can't even think of it right now, but, right to food, right to clothing, warmth, shelter. And when we were taken from our parents, and a lot of my generation right now, our parents and grandparents were part of the residential school. So, they weren't able to teach us the way they could have if we had stayed home. And they couldn't get taught the way they could have been taught had they been able to have been educated at home and not taken away to these residential schools. And then from that stemmed alcoholism, because you lost your identity already. So when you lose your identity, it's hard to pick that back up again. And many times, a lot of us go right through life without even realizing what was taken away from us from the beginning. And I'm fortunate. My dad actually was, he was a residential school survivor, and he started a group here in BC and wanted everyone to start healing from the impact of residential school. So I got a lot of my teaching from him. Unfortunately, he died in '95, and I kind of had to learn a lot of that stuff again because I fell into alcoholism. But it's all like, since we were taking, since our rights to, have that family and have that family warmth and family strength, when that was removed from us, and then we all kind of struggled as individuals in this world. And a lot of people end up down on the downtown East Side because, through alcoholism and all of that, you end up losing your you end up losing your family. And when you're losing your family, you find yourself all alone, you're on welfare, and the only place you can afford to live is here. And unfortunately, once you get evicted from an SRO, then you're living on the street. You know, it's the last rung on the ladder before homelessness.
Erica, I wanted to start with you. I talk to folks a lot, kind of at sometimes the higher kind of government levels, and it's always shocking to me, kind of how little they understand about what happens on the ground. And kind of answer this the way you want, but one of the reasons why the LEAP put this panel together was to ask kind of where do we need to go? So everyone's in a bad pandemic situation right now, but it's going to be lifted. And what do you want to see happen? Like, what do you think, like dream worlds, no restrictions, Erica runs the world? What would you put in place in terms of changing things in your community?
I'd love it if we can go to 100% social housing in everybody's house. Everyone has their own cooking facilities, their own bathroom, their own washer and dryer. That's one thing that's really lacking down here. I'd love to see, peers getting hired on the street, peers that are ready to start working, the ones that aren't caught in their addictions. If they can all, just begin programs down here at ground level and then build up from there. Instead, you're always finding that, people announcing from government level that they're going to come up and house the most vulnerable. They're going to do job innovations for them. Why not let us do that from the ground level up, and then we can show you how to run things, because they clearly don't have an idea of what our reality is.
Thanks, Erica. I'm going to kick it to Leilani. So the main talk of this panel is kind of what needs to happen. Just a heads up, we do also have a lot of folks in the chat room asking some questions around maybe taxing REITs, looking at kind of accessibility. Not sure if you can work in a bit of that into some of your responses, but where do we go from here, Leilani?
I think what Erica said was really bang on as well. There's a reason we call human rights because they're about humans. And I often say, we are experts in our own lives. And so people living in homelessness are experts in their own lives. People living in the downtown Eastside are experts in their own lives. They may need support and resources to express what their housing needs are in the context of a city or a community or neighborhood, but everyone is an expert in their own life. So that is a really good starting point, and for governments to start realizing that, in fact, solutions to the housing crisis that this country was in before the pandemic and is in during the pandemic are really, it can be, the solutions are in the hands of the people. You just have to harness people and their capacities. One of the things I want to do is not dream and say what I think could be done kind of lickety split, because a lot could be done so quickly and should be done, and under international human rights laws are obligations. First of all, homelessness should be eliminated. You can't adopt a stay-at-home policy in the face of a deadly global pandemic. You cannot adopt that policy without the logical extension of that policy being that every person living in homelessness should be properly housed. And if you can only do so on a kind of emergency basis at the outset, fine, but all of those people actually need long-term adequate housing. Period. End of story. That's so obvious. It is so obvious. And the fact that governments have not been held to the fire on that one, I find remarkable in this country and globally. I mean, it's remarkable. The World Health Organization saying that everyone should adopt a stay-at-home policy. Every single country has done that, and then have abandoned homeless people. I mean, I find it remarkable. That could be done very, so it's like, oh my God, how would we do that? Well, you know what? There are a whole lot of Airbnbs that are standing empty right now. There are a whole lot of hotel rooms that no one is occupying. Begin there. There are going to be distressed assets. Buy those assets and make them public, and with a view to doing redevelopment or repurposing. There's going to be a whole lot of office buildings that are going to not be office buildings anymore because people are going to be working from home on a long-term basis. Governments have to start being creative and move quickly. This is an incredibly vulnerable population. The pandemic has laid bare that homelessness is a matter of life and death. So there are simple non-expenditure things that governments could do. Change some laws and policies. As you said in the chat, people have been talking about REITs and the way REITs receive favorable tax or have favorable tax policies attached to them. As I understand it, in this country, the only trusts that receive the favorable tax is that it's not viewed as taxable income or revenue. And as I understand it, that's the only trust that's treated that way. So why is that? That goes to Kate's point, the privileging of housing as a commodity, of home ownership, of ownership. So, change that. I think that a lot of things could be done around better tenant protections. Now that's at the provincial level because provinces set those, but provinces need a wake-up call here. As we're seeing, tenants are incredibly vulnerable. Many tenants are vulnerable. In international human rights law, there is a principle that any eviction into homelessness, that is, an eviction that leads someone to become homeless, is a violation of international human rights law and the right to housing. So provincial governments need to get their heads around that. Oh, crap. So when a landlord evicts, they actually need to know whether that tenant is going to end up homeless. Do they have alternative housing? And if they don't, the eviction cannot proceed because the consequences of homelessness are so dire. And again, the pandemic exposes why that might be in this case. So those are just a few things. Those could happen overnight. The last thing I'll say is the government of Canada last summer adopted a piece of legislation called the National Housing Strategy Act. That act includes in it 2 new mechanisms to hold the government accountable, national level government: a federal housing advocate and a housing council made up of independent experts of some sort. And neither of those 2 accountability mechanisms have been appointed. Well, if I were the national level government and I had a pandemic on my doorstep, I would appoint someone on an interim basis to be the housing advocate to make sure that the dollars that are flowing in the way that they should, especially with an economic stimulus package, et cetera, are flowing in a way that meets our constitutional and human rights obligations. And they could have struck a panel that could also have done that. And they've chosen not to do that. They've postponed that. And I think that was an error.
Okay, Kate, I want to ask you same thing, and then we're going to have to wrap up, folks. So shoot, we might go a couple minutes over, but I'll probably just close things off after this. So, Kate, you're in charge now. What do we need to do to change things?
Oh, there are going to be a lot of changes now that I'm in charge. I agree with Erica. I think we should be moving towards 100% public housing. Obviously, that is going to require a massive change in social relations and a massive buildup of infrastructure that can't happen overnight. But what that looks like for me is every reform that happens in the housing sphere, I think, is this getting us closer to decommodified housing, or is this continuing to commodify housing? A great example of this, I think, is rent control. Rent control is talked about a lot by tenants advocates. It is a really great way of protecting renters, keeping communities strong, preventing gentrification, keeping costs stable. You know, it is a great policy. And one thing people will always say when you start talking about rent control is, oh, well, if you have rent control, you know, the market just won't build new housing. There won't be enough housing for everyone. And a lot of the time, our instinctive responses is like, actually, you know, landlords can still make loads of money and build new houses, even if there is rent control. But I think the better, stronger argument that we should start making is, if that's true, then that means that the market is fundamentally unable to provide housing for people. And that means we need to start looking at alternative ways of delivering housing to people, if we're starting from that standpoint of housing as a human right. And I think that is where, you know, I would disagree with Leilani, as I would say, I don't think capitalism has the ability to provide that for us because of the profit motive. So any reform for me has to be about how we can decommodify housing. And the other thing I want to bring up here that I've seen people kind of alluding to in the chat is that when we're building towards 100% public, 100% social housing, we also have to acknowledge the real failures of social housing in the past and work towards making social housing that is good. You know, oftentimes social housing as it exists right now, it is extremely punishing. It is very Victorian. It can be really paternalistic and moralizing for people who are in it. So part of this vision about moving towards this, that I think is a powerful organizing tool, is imagining public housing that's good, is imagining, you know, public housing where you can be a person with a disability who has access to a home that is going to meet all of your needs, all of those kinds of things. And, you know, this has been done before in other municipalities. I look to Austria a lot and also to Uruguay for really amazing examples of social housing. In Vienna, for example, a third of people live in social housing. And, you know, these are remarkable social housing complexes. You can be living in social housing and your social housing will have a rooftop swimming pool and a farmer's market and beautiful hanging gardens and spaces for your children. So I think it's really important to talk about these things, not just because, you know, they're nice and people want nice things, but because sometimes when you say social housing, people think like paternalistic welfare state, post-war housing blocks that are really unpleasant to live in and don't have room for creativity and individuality. And I don't think those things and public housing are really, really incompatible. And when it comes to, you know, funding those things, Red Vienna that I was talking about, that was funded by a really aggressive tax on real estate. And they basically use that and a luxury tax on luxury goods, and they use that to fund social housing for people. A third of the entire project was funded through taxes on luxury goods. These are political decisions that our governments make to not levy these taxes and to not fund these things. You know, I would make it illegal to operate in Canada if you were hoarding money in offshore tax havens, right? Like, I don't think you should be allowed to do business here if you're not going to pay taxes to the government that we can use to create a society that works for people. There are so many policy tools that governments have in their toolboxes, and they choose not to use them. And I think it's really important that we emphasize that these are political choices. Their hands aren't tied. There's enough money for all of these things. It's just being hoarded, you know, by certain people. It's being hoarded by banks in the Bahamas.
Oh my goodness. One of the terrible things about moderating a panel with 150 participants is that they often come up with, the participants come up with great questions, a bunch of which we can't answer right now. And the panelists, I think, expose some really interesting kind of fault lines and differences of opinions that we would like to explore. But it's 8:02. So we're going to have to wrap it up and say goodbye. I'm sure, first of all, I just want to thank the LEAP for putting this all together, specifically the works of Batul, Jody, a little bit of help from Maya. So thank you folks for helping out with this stuff. I really wanted to thank Erica Grantool, coming to us from Vancouver, coast Coast Salish territory. I want to thank Leilani, coming to us from Ottawa, providing great expertise. And hopefully I will be able to say I spoke to an Oscar winner in the future for her wonderful work on the movie Push, which I urge you folks to get out to. I also want to thank Kate Jacobson. I can't imagine what it's like to do tenant organizing in Alberta. But I think it's great work that she's doing, and I really want to thank everyone for just great kind of points and facts and different perspectives too, going all the way down to kind of just the difficult grind on the ground to intricate financial products circulating the globe, because I think housing is one of those things that touches upon us all in different ways. Thanks again to the LEAP for organizing, and hopefully in the future we'll be able to kind of talk about some of these other issues. This recording should be available for some, but please contact the LEAP about that. And this is Jordy Dent from the Tenant Federation signing off. Thanks everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you, Jordy.
Thanks, Erica.